Good evening and welcome to Turner Classic Movies. I'm Dave Karger. We are celebrating Pride Month tonight here on TCM, and I am so happy to be joined all night by a very special guest. He's a writer and monologuist on Jimmy Kimmel Live. He's one of the hosts of the podcast Keep It. He's also a friend of mine, Louis Vertel. Hello, Louis. Great to see you.
Dave, I am utterly thrilled to be here. Big fan of you, big fan of the network, big fan of you at game nights. I like beating you, but a big fan of you anyway.
We have played Pyramid together. That is a fact.
Yes.
I look forward to doing that again sometime. We have a great, fascinating lineup of films to discuss tonight, and we're going to start off with a documentary that kind of inspired the whole night. And it's The Celluloid Closet from 1995, directed by Rob Epstein and Jeffrey Friedman. I love this documentary. I think this is a film that is a must-see for anyone, gay or straight, who is interested in classic film. Why is this a documentary that you would recommend to people?
Well, first of all, it just emphasizes that queer people have always been in front of us on the silver screen, sometimes hiding in plain sight, sometimes they're coded, sometimes it takes other queer film historians to point out that you are seeing something with queer connotations to it. But it also just reminds me of why it's so much fun to love movies in the first place, which is you can catch a detail in a movie and think it resonates with you in such a specific way, and maybe nobody else saw it. But then you watch a movie like this and you realize, oh, there's like a whole category of people who's catching on to the undertones that lots of other people miss. So it just reminds you that there's lots of dimension to the movies you see, and things that you think are special to your viewing, other people are catching on to, and that might mean you're part of a community you don't even know about.
You know, I've seen this film several times over the years. I first watched it right when it came out in the mid-90s and several times since. And it's a movie that engenders in me lots of different feelings. It's maddening. It makes me angry. It makes me frustrated. But at the same time, it's so much fun. What goes through your mind when you watch it?
Well, I agree with that. There's definitely, you realize that, just heterosexuality dominates film history. If you're interested in film history, you have to be interested in heterosexuality. It's what the story is in almost every movie. But I think there's something about getting the insight of queer people who were there during the golden age of Hollywood, that they had to have a sense of humor about it, because they too are film lovers and they too are dealing with being marginalized, being forgotten about. And to hear from some of these people, they're so hilarious. I'm just so thrilled to hear from them and to realize that they're as obsessed with these movies as I am, even though we're queer people and we don't often see ourselves in movies.
Yeah. We learned at the outset that it wasn't long in the history of film that characters that could be perceived as gay showed up. There's a scene where we learn that a man is described as one of nature's mistakes, a gay man. There's a great, fascinating Chaplin bit where a guy comes in and sees Chaplin kissing another man just very innocently and then starts kind of swishing around. And you see that that stereotype existed decades ago. What are some things about this film or specific people or moments that you would want people watching to look out for?
I mean, when I walk away from this movie, I always am thinking about how queer people were coded as villains, which is something that I think a lot of people know about at this point. But just looking at, for instance, Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca, the imperiousness of Judith Anderson in that movie, and how she is both bewitching the audience and there's a slight revulsion about that character. You're watching this fear build in Joan Fontaine's eyes as she contends with this woman who's obsessed with the first Mrs. De Winter. I take the point of view of several people in this movie, which is I think it's mostly amusing to see at this point. Like, for me as an out queer person, I have nothing else to come out about. I'm in my skin. I live there. To see quote unquote representations like that, I find to be a joy, generally speaking.
Well, people will hear Harvey Fierstein, for example, say that he would rather have negative representation than no representation. Do you agree with that? It sounds like you do.
Oh, definitely. He talks specifically about the word sissy. And there's a famous old scene with a couple of waiters who are flitting about, and they're supposed to be, I guess, mockable. They look like they're drawing attention to themselves, obviously effeminate, obviously gay. But, many of us are like that. And generally speaking, that's sort of a thrilling part about being gay. So I look at that and just think, oh, that's a couple of my friends. There they go again,
Do you have any other kind of favorite coded queer characters? I mean, Sal Mineo in Rebel Without a Cause, Montgomery Clift in Suddenly Last Summer. I love Terrell Davis in Our Betters, where he just comes and steals the movie from Constance Bennett and the whole cast at the end. What are some other favorites of yours?
Oh gosh, the first person that comes to mind is Hope Emerson in Caged, the women in prison genre, and the woman who runs the prison. And what is that special quality about her that makes her extra frightening, extra commanding, and yet alien? You know, when you put those things together, I immediately think, oh, they're gay. You know, when Hollywood puts mystique and terror together, I feel like somewhere in the middle of that is the LGBT community.
Well, let's watch the movie and then we'll talk a little bit more about it afterwards, based on the groundbreaking research by film historian Vito Russo, directed by Rob Epstein and Jeffrey Friedman from 1995. Here is The Celluloid Closet. I'm back with writer and podcast host Louis Vertel to talk a little bit more about The Celluloid Closet. Louis, I know that you get a particular kick out of all the discussion of Ben-Hur thanks to Gore Vidal, right?
Yes. Well, first of all, Gore Vidal, his interviews in general, you just immediately feel like you're with, you know, a friend of yours. You know, you're sitting at some restaurant and you're out late. There's been drinking, I don't know what, but I just immediately am disarmed by how funny he is. And the discussion of Stephen Boyd's performance in that movie, you literally see him pining and the sort of delirium in his eyes in a way that matches what Gore Vidal is saying. You realize there's a queerness in that performance.
And that Charlton Heston had no idea.
And I believe that. I'm on Gore Vidal's side with that theory.
So this movie, as we mentioned, came out in the mid-90s. I remember it was coming out around the same time as The Birdcage was getting a lot of attention. But this was before so much queer representation in film. Rupert Everett in My Best Friend's Wedding, that hadn't happened yet. What's your take on when this movie was made and released in the mid-1990s? Is it too early? Is it at the right time? What's your feeling on it?
I mean, looking now in 2023, it almost feels like, oh, they couldn't have possibly done a comprehensive job with film history. You know, so much came after this movie was released. But honestly, it's such a boon to have on record these interviews with people like Arthur Lawrence, who wrote Rope, for example. These screenwriters who were there during the golden age with the biggest directors, stars of our time, who knew what it meant to be queer, to see it on the silver screen, to hint at its existence. And to see them, it just feels like it's a movie full of friends. It's a documentary that introduces you to the people you would hang out with had you been around at that time.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Arthur Lawrence. He is the screenwriter of the movie we have coming up next. So stick around. Louis and I will be back to talk about a classic Alfred Hitchcock thriller from 1948. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Turner Classic Movies. I'm Dave Karger, continuing our Pride Night celebration of films inspired by the documentary The Celluloid Closet that we just watched. All night long, I'm joined by writer, podcast host, friend of mine, Louis Vertel. Hello again, Louis.
Thrilled to be here, Dave. Thanks for having me.
One of the really interesting parts of The Celluloid Closet was the discussion of the movie that's up next. From 1948, the Alfred Hitchcock thriller Rope, starring John Dahl, Jimmy Stewart, and Farley Granger. This is a film I know you like a lot. What are some of the things that you love about it?
Well, there's another community next to the queer community that I love exploring in movies, and it's snobs. And there's a little bit of a Venn diagram situation going on there that's well explored here. And the two characters, they're so snobby in a way that is fascinating, I think, in a 2023 way. Like TV shows like The White Lotus or Succession, like people are really obsessed with taking an extra long look at people who are a little pretentious or want to put on airs. And when you hold on them for even a second, it becomes funny or it becomes ridiculous or you see the contrivance. And that is so true with these two characters. They think of themselves as elites in pseudo-philosophical way that the movie explores. And to see why they feel that way is so, I believe, hilarious. And I know it was hilarious to Alfred Hitchcock too. And to watch them deal with the crime they've committed and congratulate themselves for doing it while immediately unraveling is such a joy.
It's also part of what I know you consider a subsection of Alfred Hitchcock villains, which is kind of like the suave, nice-looking murderer.
Absolutely. Alfred Hitchcock looked at matinee idols and thought, this should be a perverted killer. And that's my favorite thing about him, is that he really saw dimensions in very famous actors that they would never explore otherwise. I mean, he loved the glint in a matinee idol's eyes. He believed he could put psychosis there. And I love that.
I remember watching Rope as a college student in film class because the professor really wanted us to focus on what everyone really thinks about when they think of Rope, which are these long takes. It's meant to look like it's one long take. How did they accomplish that? But yet there's this whole other aspect of the film, which is the gay subtext. What do you think that adds to all the goings on?
Well, it's immediate in the movie because when they perform the murder, it's the first thing you see. And they immediately describe the thrill they got over doing it together. And the discussion they have is very charged. And it's about the bond they have, that they did it together as this sort of elite intellectual class. And you're wondering what other secrets they keep together and how much joy they have in keeping those secrets and living those secrets. So something about that has a mystique, and the mystique feels pretty queer to me.
Well, it's really interesting to watch this film and count all the times that they talk about the murder, but they say, how did you feel when you did it? What happened when we did it? And it's all of this innuendo-filled dialogue that is super fun. Although then you learn in documentaries like The Celluloid Closet that there wasn't much conversation about the gay subtext. Arthur Lawrence writes in his memoir that he wouldn't be surprised if it never occurred to Jimmy Stewart that these characters were gay.
No, I mean, what context would they have? You know, subversion is a huge tool the queer community has used throughout film history to, one, represent itself, and two, to have a laugh, really. And there's a whole dialogue in this movie about choking the chicken. It's sort of like Sigmund Freud did punch up on this. It's very crazy for 1948, very surprising. If that happened in a movie, even in the 80s, I would be somewhat surprised. But way back then, I mean, post-World War II, it's just sort of mind-blowing.
So obviously there was enough going on in this movie to get it banned in cities like Memphis, Seattle, and Chicago. But let's let people watch it all these decades later, and then we'll discuss it a little bit more afterwards. Directed by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Farley Granger, John Dahl, and Jimmy Stewart, here is Rope. And I'm so happy to be back with Louis Virtel, co-host of the podcast Keep It, writer and monologue performer for Jimmy Kimmel Live. We're going to talk a little bit more about Rope. Hey there again, Louis.
I'm thrilled to be here, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Let me ask you this. Do you think the Jimmy Stewart character of Rupert reads gay? I've read a lot that not only are the John Dahl and Farley Granger characters gay, but Rupert is as well. How obvious does that come across to you?
I never considered it that way, but also it would be mind-boggling to me if Jimmy Stewart were gay. You know, I think that's what it comes down to. Like, I'm less reading into the dialogue itself or his philosophies, but I look at Jimmy Stewart and think, oh, that's my grandfather, or that's my uncle, or, you know, the kind of person who shows up at Christmas and gives your mom cashews. So no, he doesn't really read queer to me, especially because his reaction to the two of them and the grisliness of what has occurred, he immediately divorces himself from the sense of camaraderie the two of them think they have with him. So that's where I come from. Like, they're two different species in that way, ultimately.
Well, I found it fascinating because in Arthur Lawrence's memoir, he says that in his mind, Rupert and Brandon were probably, in his word, exes. Now, if that's true, I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the writing of it and the way it was performed by Jimmy Stewart, kind of agreeing with you.
Definitely. Well, he certainly did not share that theory with Jimmy Stewart. I think that would be a completely different story had he. And I would love to watch Jimmy Stewart react to that theory. I think he would start with a, well, you know.
How about the famous story that they wanted Cary Grant and Montgomery Clift for the film? How would it have been different in your mind?
Well, I have to clutch this table when you say that, because that is so shocking. And it would be a completely different movie. I mean, the two of them have a strange vulnerability that is very resonant to queer people. And I think that would have been a different story. I mean, am I allowed to say also that I think Montgomery Clift is a better actor than Farley Granger? So I think I would have believed that character a little bit more. My one problem with Rope is that Farley Granger's frustration and anxiety is a bit one note, I think.
I understand that. Before we go, what are some other favorite Hitchcock queer moments for you? You mentioned Mrs. Danvers, Judith Anderson from Rebecca earlier. I know you're an Anthony Perkins super fan. What other in the Hitchcock canon stands out to you as queer?
Well, to start with Anthony Perkins, there's a moment in the movie Hitchcock where Hitch is talking to Anthony Perkins, played by James Darcy, and he says something indicating he knows that Anthony Perkins is gay, and to kind of channel that energy, I guess, into the performance as Norman Bates. There are so many moments in that movie where just the hold on his face, like you just look into his eyes and you know he's not a womanizer. I don't know. It's in a way, it's unintentional. Obviously, he's a perverted character who's obsessed with Marion Crane, for example, but he has a lot going on internally regarding women. So just that swirl of confusion, in addition to the fact that Anthony Perkins is a queer actor, makes it a sort of fascinating read for a queer viewer.
Well, as always, Louis Vertel, it's fascinating to hear you talk about these movies. Stay with me because you and I have another film to talk about tonight, a groundbreaking 1961 drama starring Shirley MacLaine and Audrey Hepburn. Hello and welcome back to TCM. I'm Dave Karger. So glad to be here as we continue to celebrate Pride Month with a fantastic lineup of films inspired by the documentary The Celluloid Closet, which we showed earlier tonight. All night long, I've been very happy to be joined by my friend Louis Vertel. He is a writer and monologue deliverer on Jimmy Kimmel Live, as well as one of the hosts of the podcast Keep It. Hello again, Louis.
Thank you for having me, Dave. So excited to be here.
So the next film we're going to talk about is The Children's Hour from 1961 with Shirley MacLaine and Audrey Hepburn, directed by William Wyler. A fascinating film, even more fascinating to watch after seeing something like The Celluloid Closet, right? Because we heard Shirley MacLaine talk about how difficult it was to kind of get this right and the conversations or lack thereof that were taking place on the set about the actual content of this film, which is purported to be a lesbian romance or rumored lesbian romance that gets these two teachers fired.
That was a mind-blowing part of The Celluloid Closet. I mean, the movie is explicitly about, are these two women having an affair? Somebody is accusing these two women of having an affair. And so the fact that it sounds like on the set of this movie, no one said the word lesbians or, I don't know, brought someone to set who was a lesbian or whatever is just so strange. It's such a crazy juxtaposition, given that Shirley MacLaine's performance I find to be so vivid. There's something about Shirley MacLaine in general that I felt like was a big turn in movies. Like we got a lot closer to realism when Shirley MacLaine became a movie star. Something else that I had completely forgotten about is how great Faye Bainter's performance is. She reacts to the news of these allegations with a shock, and she's sort of lost in a haze of confusion. And she doesn't really trip over into hatefulness, which I think makes her harder to deal with because her imperiousness is based in shock. And she can't move past that. And I just think it's really interesting to watch. It's a brilliant performance, and her last performance.
Yeah. So let me ask you, knowing what we know about this movie and what the cast and filmmakers were or were not thinking, do you think it detracts at all from the power of this film? Or do you think we, as an audience watching it today and getting from it what we still do, is good enough?
I think it is good enough because it puts you in a moment in time. You know, the way these characters talk about these two relationships speaks to the early 60s. And there's even something about Audrey Hepburn's performance, how she never reacts with blame or really even anger towards the Shirley MacLaine character that I found to be so humane and interesting. And actually, there's a long scene of her just sort of thinking where she's walking away. And this film reminds me of my favorite Audrey Hepburn performance, which is in The Nun Story, which is basically this long, epic Fred Zinnemann movie where you just watch Audrey Hepburn think and reconsider her values the entire movie. And I feel like you get a glimpse of that in The Children's Hour.
Well, clearly, Audrey Hepburn and William Wyler made some magic together, not only with this film, but Roman Holiday as well. I'm excited for people to watch this, especially if they have never before. Louis, hang around. You and I will talk about it a little bit more afterwards. From 1961, starring Audrey Hepburn and Shirley MacLaine, here is The Children's Hour. I'm so happy to be back with Louis Vertel to talk a little bit more about The Children's Hour. And Louis, famously, Lillian Hellman, who wrote the play on which this film is based, was not a fan of this adaptation. She felt it was too sanitized. I found a review in Newsweek that said it's a film that takes a serious whack at an important topic, but just doesn't connect head on. Do you agree with some of those criticisms?
When you're in 2023, you can forgive almost any very old movie for not being as aware on queer issues as maybe it should be. But it is interesting to read articles from that time that recognize that quality. Like maybe I'm being too soft on these things, but you know, I personally, when I'm turning on an Audrey Hepburn movie, don't expect to get a Vito Russo level read on queerness.
That's true. And let's also compare The Children's Hour to the first adaptation of the play, which was a film also directed by William Wyler called These Three, where the plot was wildly different, right?
Yes, it was much drier and less explicit about what was allegedly going on between these two characters, which is crazy because in the 1961 version, it's not like they're getting into the nitty gritty of it, if you will. But there are some great performances in it. Miriam Hopkins is also in that movie. But my favorite performance in that movie is the tattletale in it, Anita Granville, because that child character is very, very important. You have to believe there is something really driving this person to ruin these two people. And it's fascinating, going back to the Children's Hour, that a child at that time would know that could be that damaging. You know, it's that ingrained that when you're that young, you know, queerness is sort of a nimbus cloud that can hang over somebody and be detrimental to their lives.
Yeah. Well, and at least in comparison to these three, where it was two women in love with the same man, at least in the Children's Hour, it's a man and a woman in love with the same woman. So there's a little progress, at least on that front. Before I let you go, the next film up is Queen Christina from 1933, starring Greta Garbo, also discussed in The Celluloid Closet. What would you want people to focus on as they're about to watch that?
What I would recommend focusing on is Greta Garbo, because Greta Garbo is so bewitching. You can't look away. There's a sophistication about her, a knowing about her, and just the way she will look at a character and then they're bewitched too. It's like you relate to the other characters on screen. You're like, I'm in love with this woman too. I can't believe this woman.
Well, if people are interested in hearing more from you, Louis, they should check out your podcast, Keep It, or they should watch Jimmy Kimmel Live and hope that you pop up. I'm always happy when you do. But thanks so much for being here with me all night. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. And specifically for this discussion, I love this stuff so much. And it's such a joy to share it with you.
I love it. And as I said, stick around because coming up next is a wonderful drama from 1933 starring Greta Garbo. Stick around.